welcome to the Open Fire Podcast, an open and honest dialogue about fire safety, the construction industry and business ethics, with some of the brightest sparks the UK has to offer. With me, I have the fire industry's answer to Joe Rogan, technical fire safety expert, Tom Gilbert. Tom, put your hand up. Tom and I have been doing the Open Fire Podcast over the summer. Tom, something's different.
Well, I was going to say, Dave, now you're not being filmed on a camera, you've lost a lot of weight.
Yeah, we do have, I say the camera adds £10. We normally have 4 cameras on us. For those that are wondering what I'm talking about and looking at me and thinking, he looks pretty big to me, I was quite a lot bigger when we started this series in the summer. I've lost 3 stone, however, we put the episodes out in entirely different order to what we record them. Yeah. Hence, people have been concerned I have a fluctuating weight problem. But it's all good. I was actually referring to we don't have our sofa.
Well, we don't have the sofa, Dave, and I didn't read the next bit on the cue. That's okay. That's the bit right of this. Yeah. So where has the sofa gone, Dave? Where's the studio?
So we're not in the studio. We're in the Kensington Olympia for our first live recorded episode for London Build 24.
Amazing, and we've had some good guests, haven't we, so far, Dave, since we've relaunched the podcast?
We have a lot of good guests this summer. To name a few: Dame Julia, Sir Ken Knights, Bob Neal, James Cox from Fireco, Clive Miles, Holly Watson on BSA, Tim Barker, Joe Taylor, Jessica John, Andy Robson, Danny White, Jan Taranzak, John Powell, Jamie Davis, Stuart Brown, Mike Wards, Gavin Stelly, to name a few.
So well we know.
Well, there's a few more that we haven't mentioned yet. We'll come on to in a sec. Do you just want to explain to the audience why we set up the Open Fire Podcast, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. So the podcast's now 5 years old, although we had a 4-year break, didn't we, Dave? When I got kidnapped by a Tier 1 contractor and wasn't allowed to talk publicly about anything for obvious reasons. And we've rejigged it, new branding, and got some investment. It's all very quality driven. And the idea is to give everyone a voice, give access to CPD that's a little bit easier to digest, something that you can do on the train rather than at a specific time, and it's all free, and we just wanted to give everybody access to the right people that we felt would say the right sort of stuff that we would all find interesting in the industry. So that's the whole purpose of it. And obviously, out of that guest list, we've chosen the 2 that we felt had actually the most engagement and had probably the most interesting podcasts, I would say. That doesn't mean you just listen to these 2 podcasts, by the way. There's loads and they're all really good, but these 2 were obviously really good. So, Dave, do you want to introduce our first guest?
Yeah, so our guest today's episode, firstly, Aman Sharma. Aman is a former fire officer and also a fire engineer, having previously served as Deputy Chair of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, providing strategic guidance to the Secretary of State on building safety standards. He is currently CEO of Totus Digital and a member of the Building Safety Regulators Building Advisory Committee, leading the approved document B technical review. He also serves as chair of the High Risk Building Thematic Working Group, as well as chair of the British Standards Committee FSH/0OZ Strategic Direction and ongoing development of fire safety standards. Thanks for coming, Aman. Would you like to introduce me?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a man in theory needs no introduction in the fire industry, but I'll give you one anyway. So, it's lovely to have another author on the stage, Dave, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Dave writes books as well as web.
One book.
Yeah, one book.
Bestseller.
One book, 2 copies. And so, Peter Apps, thank you for joining us on stage today. He's author of the book that I hope many of us have read, which is Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen. Fantastic book. He's currently the contributing editor at Inside Housing. He's also a freelance journalist. He was awarded the British Journalism Awards Special Journalist of the Year in 2017 and 2018, an International Building Press Journalist of the Year in 2017, and he even made the Orwell Prize shortlist in 2019. So again, thank you very much for joining us again on the Open Fire Podcast.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so the panel discussion today is titled From Lessons Learned to Future Changes, the Evolving Landscape of Building Safety. And we're going to try and take you on a little journey from the days before Grenfell to what's happened since Grenfell, and hopefully looking forward to the future. So to start us off then, Peter, can you take us back in time a little bit in your investigative work, when you, particularly in your book and in your episode with us on the Open Fire podcast, you exposed the fundamental issues that led to the Grenfell disaster, and the causes and culpability. Could you begin by summarising the key failings that contributed to this tragedy and set the stage for today's discussion in terms of the individuals or organisations that failed in their duties that led up to the tragedy?
Yeah, sure. I'll do my best, Dave, over the sort of cinematic music that's sometimes blasting out here. But yeah, I mean, there's a really long story involving a lot of different organisations, a lot of different failures. But a lot of them come down to the same sort of thing, which is the fact that we as a sort of collective in the fire industry and as a society knew that we had this problem in we were using increasingly combustible materials for the external facades of buildings, but we were still relying on the traditional fire safety strategy of stay put. And putting those two things together was creating the conditions for a really serious disaster, because as we presumably everyone in this audience will know, stay put relies on the ideas of compartmentation, fire remaining within the flat of origin for 2 hours, and if you put combustible materials on the outside of a building, you're going to unzip all of that protection in one fell swoop. And the really tragic thing about this story is how long we knew that and how detailed our knowledge of that was. From as early as 1991, the government had evidence about the risk of facade fires. They ran a pilot scheme on a block of flats in Knowsley in Merseyside, where glass reinforced plastic cladding caught fire and took the fire off all 11 stories of the building very, very rapidly, because a very serious fire. Luckily everyone was able to escape alive, but that gave us really the opportunity to learn lessons from that, learn about the danger of using these kind of materials, the danger of doing so when you don't have an evacuation strategy in place. But we didn't want to learn those lessons. We wanted to sweep it under the carpet. In fact, the evidence has shown that was quite literal. I mean, there's a handwritten memo in the aftermath of that fire, which effectively says that the government has decided not to make a particularly big deal out of it. And so the lessons weren't learned, and that story carried on throughout the 90s. We were running tests on cladding materials which had a Class 0 rating, which made them compliant with the minimum standard in building guidance, and these materials were failing, drastically failing. But the prime manufacturers who made them and the government officials who set the regulations were content not to tighten standards, not to lift standards, not to issue any warnings to industry, but allow the status quo to keep going. And that carried on through the 2000s. In the early 2000s, there was official government testing on a various number of cladding systems, including the ACM product, which is ultimately used on Grenfell. Again, this is government-sponsored testing, paid for with taxpayers' money. And that testing had to be stopped after 8 minutes to protect the safety of people present in the testing facility, because flames had risen 9 metres above the top of the fire testing rig. At that point, we as a country could have banned this material, stopped it being installed in buildings, decided to just stick to higher fire performance type materials when we were over cladding buildings. But because we're focused on reducing costs, reducing burdens on industry, allowing manufacturers to have access to market, those weren't things that the government wanted to do. And throughout this period, as the inquiry showed, the manufacturing industry really took advantage of the weaknesses in our regulatory system to get products onto the market and onto high-rise buildings that were just fundamentally unsuitable and fundamentally dangerous. And contractors, building owners, clients, fire engineers, unfortunately, either turned a blind eye to that or actively became complicit in it, signing off desktop studies that justified the use of these materials even if they didn't really have the right evidence to do that. And as a whole collective, we all became a little bit complicit, a little bit unwilling to look at the things that might be going wrong and the consequences it might have, and the conditions for a disaster which should never have happened were allowed to become commonplace. And unfortunately, we're seeing now in Kensington, only a couple of miles from Grenfell Tower, it was a building, 129 flats, about 300 people in it, and dozens and dozens of children where that fire broke out, with obviously the tragic consequences that we all know so well. I mean, there's been a lot of facade fires around the world, and there were a lot of warnings before Grenfell. There's never been a facade fire that's caused that level of fatality. This was something that we should never have allowed to happen. And so, yeah, looking forward to talking about what we can take from that and how we can learn about preventing something like that happening again.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Aman, following on from Pete's points, are you able to share some of your own insight into maybe some of the conflicts that might have existed in government that you perhaps feel might have contributed towards the tragedy?
Yeah, certainly. It's very hard to disagree with some of the key points pulled out by Peter there, and I think the takeaway line for me is that piece around the complicit nature, and the term I would use is collective responsibility, which I think the inquiry played out in quite some significant detail. There was a very clear pseudo-transparency. I think that the 58 recommendations capture quite succinctly that show that not only was there a culture of a pursuit to complete a commercially viable project instead of placing resident safety at the heart of that, it was a refurbishment project specifically, but there was a clear attempt to conceal information that could have clearly prevented our worst tragedy since the Second World War due to a residential fire. One thing I would say is that the machinations of how government works are incredibly complex. And on one hand, you have a bank of civil servants and well-meaning individuals, human beings, residents like us, parents like us, who are proactively trying to do the right thing, introduce policy that is in the public interest and for the common good. And as Peter rightly says, the origin point of this particular issue is very difficult to pin down. You can go down to the early 90s and we can keep unpacking through the decades where this actually manifested as a source point, if you like, for the problem in and of itself. And that tells you one thing and one thing only, that this is not a red or a blue political issue, okay? There is multiple administrations that need to take responsibility and accountability for what happened in June 2017, which points to Dame Judith's key theme that she pulls out. Sadly, she's not with us today, that this was a systematic breakdown. And I think when we think about that, what I refer to as the government machinations, as it were, as an advisor to these people and to ministers as well, I am not envious of the position that civil servants are in. I really am not. They are there to advise their ministers of the day who are taking one direction or another, whether it be a politically red one or a politically blue one or a coalition one, and a culture of deregulation, and have, believe it or not, very little influence on top of what the minister of the day decides to do or not do. And I think those who are watching the inquiry in some detail, one thing I will be quite explicit about is the memory of the deplorable nature of the member of the upper house and his conduct at a public inquiry, where families and friends of those that lost their lives were looking for answers. And you saw a snippet into life, or what life can look like on the political landscape, that conflicts with that common good and public interest piece that we are here advocating for on a daily basis.
I think for the audience, there was obviously someone that needed to go to lunch fairly quickly after his comments on the at the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which was quite shocking. I mean, obviously, just to follow on from that, obviously the deregulation in the 1980s was pretty significant, and in both your episodes, actually, you talked about how, you know, 1 out, 1 in turned into 2 out, 1 in to 3 out, 1 in, and I think, Peter, you got to the point of 4 or 5 pieces of legislation needs to disappear in order to get another piece in. Do you think that the deregulation drive since the 1980s will have contributed in some part, at least, to the situation we found ourselves in? I mean,
yeah, well, I think that myopic approach to all legislative development carries with it that significant risk. Now, it's not lost on me, and I'm sure everyone in the crowd as well, that over the pond we're starting to see a very similar approach starting to take shape, which I'm sure will gain the traction it will undoubtedly take from February onwards next year. But, you know, the approach of looking at things or components in a functional system in a non-functional way does not carry through to me. No.
Thanks, man. I'm just going to take the opportunity to promote Peter App's book for anybody that hasn't read it, Show Me the Bodies, because he won't do it himself. But it's a fantastic book. There's a lot of technical insight in there, as well as the human stories accompanied with it. If you are in the industry and you haven't read it, even if you're not in the industry, it's a fascinating read. Although we all understand broadly what happened in Grenfell, Peter does a great job at really getting to the nuts and bolts of it, so I would fully recommend.
I was convinced you were going to do your book then, actually.
My book, The Department of Conspiracy, is a comedy thriller you can find on Amazon, and not nearly as good as Peter's book. Aman, bring us up to the more recent past. So we've kind of set the background. Could you provide us a summary of the legislative framework and what the government have been doing in the last 5 to 7 years? So in other words, since Grenfell, what has been accomplished so far, and what sort of discussions have been taking place? Can you give us any insight?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a snapshot of what's happened in the immediate aftermath of June 2017, we now have, of course, new primary legislation, the Building Safety Act, a whole host of secondary legislation, including, of course, the key piece of legislation that most will be concerned about in this room, I'm sure, in the high-risk building procedural regulations. We've seen several amendments to the building regulations themselves at a functional level. So Schedule 1 of the building regulations and subsets of those as well, by virtue of several amendments to the statutory guidance or approved documents as they're colloquially called. And you've also seen amendments to key fire safety legislation across the industry as well. I would say it is incredibly difficult to bring primary legislation into the legislative framework. It does tend to take the amount of time that the Building Safety Act, for example, did take. There were conversations about potentially just amending the Building Act 1984 to bring those requirements in, but that is just as difficult to do as it is to introduce primary. I share the frustrations at how long this has taken, holding the pen on some of these conversations and some of the documents that have informed the secondary legislation in particular. It is a very laborious and long process, and it's ridiculous because it needs to be right. We can't get something out there that either doesn't do the job or isn't functionally appropriate when it's trying to be applied by yourselves and others across the industry. One of the things that I'm really glad, Dave, the government have adopted, and we've had 3 administrations, I think, since my time as an advisor. When I was first asked the question, well, how long do we think the building safety programme, of which was a programme to coordinate the development of that legislative framework, was conducted, how long do we think we need to account for that to last for, essentially? What's the end date of the building safety programme? And the answer from individuals like myself and my colleagues in the Building Regulations Advisory Committee and other advisors as well was, why does it need to end?
Yeah.
Why should it end? Isn't that what got us here in the first place? Why are we not potentially looking at building safety as a dedicated policy programme within, now renamed again, MHCLG, with a mandate and a commitment to the public that we will never ever take building safety off the agenda, and that has happened. So building safety is as much a priority in the ministry as the other departmental priorities under the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister at the moment, which is really good to see.
Thanks, Aman. That's interesting last point. Peter, do you put a view of the performance of, let's say, consecutive governments over the past 7 years?
Yeah, I mean, we've been on quite a journey, haven't we, over the last 7 years? It's been, but the process is, I think, what it's felt like to me is the government has had to constantly be reluctantly pushed into action. And that's been consistent, whoever's been in charge, including the current administration, to be honest. I remember the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire, and it did feel like Theresa May, who was Prime Minister then, was very personally affected by it. She felt like she felt something, and had some sort of a desire to do right by the residents and the survivors and other people who lived in buildings with dangerous materials, but that never really carried through into action. Once it got down to the pounds and pence, that's where the emotion suddenly stopped. I remember getting a letter when I was working in Inside Housing sent to me that had been sent by Aman Sharma, who was Housing Minister at the time, and he'd been asked by a local authority with 11 or 12 council-owned high-rise buildings for some funding to retrofit sprinklers. So obviously a recommendation going all the way back to the Lackenor House Coroner's Inquest in 2013. And he wrote back saying, our view is that this fire safety measure would be additional, not essential, and so we're not minded to grant you additional borrowing capacity to do it. And this is less than 2 months after we've seen people die at Grenfell Tower. You know, already we're thinking about government borrowing limits and, is this really necessary? And it took a lot of campaigning, which I was actually involved in to quite the high extent at that point, to just get money to remove ACM, PE cladding from other buildings. You know, we went through 2 years after Grenfell with other buildings with not just other types of dangerous cladding, but that exact same petrol-like material on the external walls, without the government putting its hand in its pocket and saying, well, let's get this stuff off. Slowly we've kind of moved through a position. The government didn't want to ban combustible materials but on buildings above 18 metres. So we were still building new buildings that are now, some of the buildings that are being remediated were built after the Grenfell Tower fire. All of these things have been slow and grudging and partial. And I think it shows the political establishment, to me, that wants this problem to be over. You know, they want this to be fixed. Can we just do, so we've done something now, we've set up a building safety regulator now, we've put out a building safety fund now, surely this is over. Why are you still asking us for more? And I find that attitude frustrating, upsetting even, because you look at what happened and how we got there. Surely it should be a line in the sand, let's ask how this happened and let's work out how not to let it happen again. And it's never felt like they've wanted to give it that level of gravity.
Thank you. So unlike the, dare I say, the wonderful Boris Johnson, who on the publishing of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry 1 said, yeah, the government will do absolutely everything, don't worry, you do it, and then obviously didn't quite manage it, but that was his commitment. The current government have obviously indicated that they would review the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 2 report over around 6 months, is the number that they put out. And Aman, a question for you. Are you allowed to elaborate more openly on the discussions being had within government to give us a bit of a flavour around the prevailing viewpoints of the new government and what their likely responses might entail?
I'll try.
I thought you were going to say no.
So the first thing I'll say is that in the immediate publication of Sir Martin's work, by the way, his excellent work, he and his team, on the 4th of September, there was a conversation about who should lead on the coordination of the response, and the decision was made at the beginning of the street. have absolutely not to do that. And it's quite by design, of course, that the Deputy Prime Minister is Executive Minister of the Ministry, and the administration score hard about how they want to convey the importance of building safety moving forward. So the Ministry is coordinating that response now. It's engaging with key stakeholders across the industry. Clearly, there is a large focus on the fire safety sector more broadly. There were some quite interesting recommendations made, of course, for fire engineers, but also for building control officers as well, in terms of where their industry might go. And certainly what isn't happening, I think we could all have worked out for ourselves by now, is that the government is minded to take the approach that the administration of the day took for the phase one report. Okay, so there is not a carte blanche acceptance of 58 recommendations in one foul swoop. And each recommendation is being thought through very meticulously and right down through to feasibility, the potential impact assessment of introducing variations of policy that might manifest as an introduction of a response to that recommendation, which includes, of course, the all-important cross-departmental engagement to Department for Business and Trade, Home Office. There was a greater strategic level recommendation, of course, for something I would love to see all fire safety legislation falling under one department, rather than Home Office looking after this, HSE looking after that, Ministry looking after this, and these departments work within the same building and struggle to communicate sometimes amongst themselves. So it would be highly appropriate, I would assert, that one departmental body is responsible for the fire safety legislation that we are governed by. And the last point is the timeline point, which is probably a little bit the last that I can expand on without breaking the confidentiality point. So you're quite right, the Prime Minister committed to a 6-month turnaround, and it does look like the government's on track to respond by February, March next year, and that will be a fulsome response to those recommendations with a high-level indication of what the government is minded to do in response to those recommendations. So that will not be the government saying we are doing X, Y, and Z. It will be we're going to come and consult, because that's what we do. We're going to come and consult with the industry about a potential route forward for recommendation 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. So things will start to move quite quickly in Q1, Q2 next year on that one.
Thank you. And I think to go back to a podcast that we had Sir Ken Knight and Sir Bob Neal on, Sir Bob Neal, who was of course the Fire Minister, talked about how there was very clear siloed approach between fire and building regulations in particular, and obviously as the Fire Minister he wasn't ever privy really to any of the building regulation applications that were going on. So I think I'd certainly be supportive of fire related matters being in one ministry. Thank you for that. So Pete, as an advocate of the survivors obviously, what would your stark words be to the government to concentrate on over the next 4 years?
Well, touching briefly on, very interested to listen to Aman's answers to that question. And I think I do think that the approach that they've taken is more honest and more sensible than the one the previous government took. I don't think, heaven forbid, Boris Johnson lie with the truth, but I don't think he ever had any intention of bringing in all of those recommendations in their entirety, and neither should he really. I mean, an inquiry is not infallible. These things might have implications that need to be thought about, and a process of consultation, open consultation, is welcome. I mean, I think the problem with the last government's approach was that consultation was behind closed doors, and what they were trying to do was sort of hoodwink, I think, the bereaved and survivors into thinking everything was being implemented when it wasn't. And that, in the end, the government ended up going to court 3 times to justify its failure to bring some of those recommendations into force. And I don't think any of the recommendations to government were ever fully implemented. There's checks and files, self-closes now, and I actually think the government kind of moderated that a little bit compared to what the inquiry recommended, ultimately in quite a good way. But what I think they should have been doing is saying, we're going to have a conversation, we're going to talk openly and honestly about how that process is going to work and what we are going to do and what we're not going to do and why. So in that respect, I think that there's reasonably happy with the start that's been made. I think that what has to be understood here, though, is that you're not going to be able to just sneak this through in half measures, which is what's always been tried to do in the past with these kind of reforms. Keep the status quo going and just do some tinkering, can we get away with, we've got some change down the back of the sofa, let's set up a building safety regulator. The construction regulator that the inquiry report has recommended would be a substantial expansion of state power, and that would have to be backed by resource, by primary legislation, by a big team of people to make that operation work and be a success and achieve the things it wants to achieve. Otherwise, it's going to fall flat on its face, and it's going to turn into delay and obfuscation, and we're going to be talking about it as red tape that needs to go the bit. So I think it needs to look at these recommendations hard. It needs to understand that what it's being asked to do is actually change things, not just give the appearance of changing things, and then it needs to go ahead and do the things that make sense. From a broader perspective, I think that we're about to embark on a programme of building 1.5 million homes over the course of this Parliament. That'll be the most homes we've built as a country since the 1960s and 1970s. It will be the most homes this country has built by the private sector as opposed to the council sector in modern history. Every time we have arts development to those kind of levels, we have had a building safety crisis, not long afterwards, because the incentives are all wrong and people manage to persuade the government to look the other way in order to get the numbers they want. And that has always resulted in human suffering and costs to the state that exceeds the amount of money they might afford to get otherwise. We're still dealing with the legacy of large panel systems buildings, which were built in the last big building boom in the 60s and 70s. We cannot do that. One of the hardest things to do in construction is re-engineer the built environment once it's built. What you need to do is build it properly the first time. That's better for the residents who will ultimately live in it, it's better for the government, it's better for the taxpayer, it's better for everyone. And Keir Starmer needs to realise that needs red tape. He might not like it, he might not be told when he sits down for his next nice dinner or Taylor Swift concert or Arsenal match with a house building lobbyist, and it's a very good idea, but in the end, history tells us, regulate the industry properly, get good houses out of them, and everybody is a winner. And if you don't, the price will be paid, and it will probably be paid by someone who ends up, because of their economic circumstances, living in the worst quality housing that gets built in that next boom. So, my message would be, let's just please do it right this time.
I'm just going to stand up at the lectern, Tom. 2 reasons. Anybody that watches our podcast will know I have an uncanny ability to look uncomfortable in any seat whatsoever. But also, I'm going to.
I was designed for chairs.
No, I'm not well designed for chairs. But also, I'm going to ask Tom a question just to give our guests a little break. And also, I'm contractually obliged to ask Tom a question every episode in case his head explodes.
How are we doing for time today?
I'm going to ask you to be relatively brief, Tom.
That means we've got no time. Awesome.
So we've spent quite a lot of time over the last 6 months at various events, discussions with people across the industry. Have expressed a significant amount of dissatisfaction with the performance of the regulator today. Criticisms such as a lack of competency, excessive red tape and regulation, a lack of advice regarding building safety cases, severe delays with the gateway process. Is the gateway process really needed just for self-closed devices?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to preface this with, this is my devil's advocate question. Now and again I have to ask these questions on behalf of people. It doesn't mean they represent my own personal thoughts. But Tom, is the regulator underperforming? Are good, honest construction companies just finding themselves being unnecessarily obstructed by regulators and their excessive regulation?
I think that is your actual opinion, Dave.
Not at all. No, it's not at all. So I think to answer the question, I'd certainly reflect back at the FireCo event that you and I went to and chaired, and there's a couple of FireCo people about. Well done, you guys. One of which was a guest. Very entertaining, and it's coming out soon. we probably the largest round table ever that was rectangular, of course, but it was probably about 70 or 80 people from social housing organisations, construction companies, specialist contractors, consultants, and we really did start to get into the nuts and bolts about how people really felt about the regulator and the gateway process, and I think the statistic, and there was a number of Freedom of Information Act requests by a number of people, one of which was the Fire Industry Association, to say how many applications have you had for Gateway 2 and how many have you approved, and the numbers were pretty bad actually. So there was just over 1,000 applications at the time that the Freedom of Information Act request happened, and out of those 1,000, only 15% had actually successfully been approved, and I think the reality of that statistic is you can look at that statistic. The beauty of statistics, right, is you can look either way at statistics. Statistically, less people die of having a heart attack in McDonald's than they do in hospital. So if you're about to have a heart attack, go to McDonald's and you're less likely to die. But that's the statistics don't quite work, right? The reality is more people have them in hospitals. So I think you can look at it two ways. One is only 15% have been approved because the quality of the applications were awful. Or the other way you can look at it is only 15% have been approved because the regulator is really bad at approving them, right? So you can look at it in two ways. My suspicion is that it's probably a little bit of both. People don't know how to get through the gateway process yet. They don't know the level of information that they need to provide. They don't necessarily understand what type of information they need to provide. Then in the same way, you've got a regulator who is probably fairly worried about approving stuff because no one wants to be the first, and actually they're saying, well, is this enough information? Maybe I'll ask for a bit more. And we see in the statistics that there are a lot of applications that are being pushed back to the original reply for more information. And the reality is, very small number of the cases out of those thousands were sitting without an individual caseworker. There are only a very small number that the regulator were currently looking at, and I think we're in the 3% of them, so it's very, very small. So I think this is just the reality of the new world, right? We have to go through a few project cycles, and we're going to have to experience the pain a little bit going through the gateway process, and the regulator's going to have to get better at what it does as it goes through this journey of employing an awful lot of people. And the last point that you talked about, the specific criticism that's being levied around fire door replacements and whether or not they should go through Gateway 2 or not, I think the reality is that Grenfell Tower had circa 70 fire door closers that had been disconnected at the time the fire had happened. And obviously the inquiry has identified that as a relatively significant contribution to the fatalities and the significance of the fire. So actually it goes full circle when you think about it, that if door closers were missing on the building that was not undergoing refurbishment, if I'm going to go and refurbish 100 doors in a block of flats, it's highly likely I'm going to have to disconnect some closers on that journey. So it makes perfect sense that I'd have to go through a gateway process to demonstrate to the regulator what I'm going to do on replacing those doors and how I'm going to mitigate the risks that replacing them will create while the work is happening, and indeed demonstrate to the regulator that I'm going to do it properly and the doors I'm going to install are as good as they need to be. So I think in summary of that, the construction and fire industry had its shot at self-regulation. We had our chance. We were warned and warned and warned that if we did not regulate ourselves, someone else would do it for us. We then had Grenfell Tower, and lo and behold, we're now being regulated by a regulator that's not going to be very nice, and neither should they be. But we did have our chance, and I feel like we potentially blew it, so we've all got the opportunity to get better now.
Thanks, Tom. I want to move the discussion forward because we do want to get questions from you guys in, but we just want to look more a little bit at the future now. Aman, I think this is one for yourself really. Where do you see the building safety landscape evolving over the next 3 to 5 years? How do you see the development of the regulator role and the sort of changes? A lot of people are asking when buildings under 18 metres
Yes, they should. And the reason they should, there's a phrase I use quite regularly, Tom, when we talk about the phases of building safety, regulations, evolution, and its transition through different versions. And I talk about it being the end of the beginning rather than the beginning of the end. So there was a lot of backslapping after the publication of the Building Safety Bill, and then the Building Safety Act, and then the secondary legislation. And I like pausing to celebrate sometimes when something, when a milestone has been reached. But I think the danger we run with that is that we stop. I spoke about that perpetual approach to building safety that's being encouraged right from a senior government level and hopefully being cascaded throughout the industry. And I would consider this point to be a continuation of the end of the beginning as opposed to the beginning of the end of this, because if we fast forward and we're here in 12 months' time, hopefully we'll start to see the first sort of drafts of statutory instruments that are being introduced to implement those 58 recommendations. That's where I want to be in 12 months, and I want to see the meat on the bone as that legislative framework continues to evolve. In terms of the timelines associated with that, of course, that's something that, as I alluded to earlier on, it just needs to be very carefully thought through, as Pete said earlier on, because if we are intending to build at the rate that the government is committing to build, Peter is spot on. The first thing that tends to go by the wayside is safety standards, where we're focusing on volume. So look, we need to be very realistic about what we're trying to achieve here. We need to be contributing to consultations as well, whether they be consultations for regulation themselves, British standards, international standards. All of these things make a difference to how we live, operate in the built environment, and it needs that public engagement for it to happen. So, I think that look ahead, as it were, the landscape of the regulatory framework will continue to evolve in much the same way that we've seen it evolve over the last 6 to 7 years, and I trust it will be done. In fact, I'm confident it will be done in a equally proportionate but rigorous way, so that we don't have to repeat this.
So just to push you on that point about under 18 meets, is there been discussions about time-wise when we should anticipate that coming into scope?
There are discussions, but none that I can share publicly at the moment. So there are triggers in the Building Safety Act to scale this regime up. Everyone should be aware of that. There is a trigger in the Act itself to change the scope of the regime for higher risk buildings. My position is that we don't entertain that until we get this bit right first. On the flip side to this, there is nothing stopping diligent developers and diligent social housing providers or private sector housing providers, asset managers, facility managers, from applying that same scale or that same standard of building safety on all of their portfolio of stock rather than just the 18 metre plus. In fact, there are economies of scale potentially in doing so, and there are some good case studies actually to demonstrate that. So why wait for the regulation when you can be doing it already?
Fair point. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so I always advocate for even commercial buildings to start thinking about it as well, not just residential.
I think maybe we just skip to sort of final questions, Tom, before we open up to the floor.
Yeah, no problems, that's all.
So, giving us
There's always someone
baddie eyes.
ruining our party in the back.
So just to give us something positive to look forward to, and this is to both of you, Aman and Peter, what positive changes do you foresee in the industry moving forward over the next 5 years? What can we be a little bit more hopeful and positive about?
Well, I do just want to echo Aman's point, because he is popping into my head as he was answering that question about below 18 metre buildings, and I just wanted to, you probably saw it in the news, but last week there was a fire in Zaragoza in Spain that killed 10 people. That's a one-storey building, I think, 1 or 2 stories. No external facade fire, but it's an old people's home. It's a residential care facility, and from the look of these and the eyewitness accounts, very serious failures with internal compartmentation. The population of the building who's using it is very, very, very relevant to how high risk it is. And like Aman says, you need to look at the fires that have happened in this country and around the world to understand that, not what the government regulation says at any given time. The fire doesn't really mind what the government regulation says, the risks unchecked. In terms of the positive advances, look, I would say a couple of things. I mean, I think one thing I'm actually more positive about than a lot of the commentators on this is the competency. I do think that the competency exists in order to get these things right. I think we're clever enough as a society, we're advanced enough to build buildings correctly and maintain it properly. Those aren't the problems. The problems are the incentives not to do it. And so those incentives are the things that we need to take away and change. I think the growth of technology, you need to be careful with technology. Technology can sometimes create more problems than it solves from a fire safety sense. But we don't need to, in 2024, be lying around with the clipboard opening and showing fire doors to see whether or not they self-close. Those are things that AI and just the Internet of Things generally can start to solve for us really, really easily. I was speaking to a cyberspace engineer the other day who's investigating how we build housing on Mars. And if we can work that out, we can work out how to build and maintain fire safety properties on Earth. So I think the capacity is there, the knowledge is there, the ability is there, and because conversations like this, which never happened before Grenfell, are happening now, and there's much more toleration, I think, of understanding that we might have got things wrong and that we might need to change. The conditions are there to get it right, but I don't want to give false hope because the conditions and the incentives to get it wrong are still the ones that drive the industry. So change could happen, but it needs to be pushed. Is that where I think about that? But
Aman, I'm just going to interrupt before you answer, if you may. I want to open out to the floor, guys. Anybody got any pressing questions they'd like to ask whilst we've got Aman and Peter here? If there's no hands go up, I'm going to allow Aman to answer. Somebody.
They will be to ask.
It's just a general question. It's been understood that heat spray, as opposed to speeding water, is a safest way of hiding art. So, what is your?
This is actually so good, actually. I'll answer in these. Sure, I had to cover videos as well. So I think it touches on your point. It's about technological innovation and the embracing of that innovation to look at it in a very scientific and empirical way to at least ask the question in this example, do we need to look at various forms of suppression if suppression is into residential buildings that may bring either cost efficiencies or maintenance efficiencies and so on and so forth. What I will say is that we have, I'm a huge champion of digital innovation, by the way, have been my whole career. I'm a huge champion of building safety innovation measures as well. With sprinklers specifically, going to Peter's earlier point, for the lobbying and the banging of the drums that we've had to do to get sprinklers even in the buildings that we've got them in, saying it's just still not enough, even when we go through new design or retrofitting. We've got years and years and decades, if you like, of scientific data that underpin why the coefficients of discharge rates, etc., are exactly what they are, but we don't yet have for some of this new technology. That is not to say that some of this new technology, and there was various systems around the floor, I'm sure you'll see today, couldn't add value in the future, either as a substitute or an alternative to traditional focus. Thanks.
So yeah, well, on this thing, I think that is a really good example of why the change in the recommendations around the construction regulator and taking fire safety testing into a more neutral zone is really important, and having properly published, properly understandable information, because I'm a journalist. I get a lot of people coming to me from time to time saying, we've got this fantastic product, it's going to solve the problem, can you write a piece about it? And I don't want to lend my name and my editorial brand to something that's not good. With misting, there's a lot of companies out there doing it. They show me this testing, and they say, look, we've had this testing done by Totus, it's fantastic, puts the fire out, saves lives, saves money. But how can I trust it? It might be perfect, it might be what it says it is, I don't know, but it might not be, because that is the same testing regime that told us combustible insulation is going to be fine. And we need things that people like me and people who are buying these products can actually trust. And unfortunately, when it's the manufacturer handing you a brochure and saying, my product does X, and here's a test that proves it does X, in this current climate, anyone who trusts that is an idiot, I'm afraid, because we have seen what happened when people trusted that. And so to get things like misting and these technological innovations that we do want to see, we need testing that we can trust, a testing process that is open and transparent. And at the moment we don't have that, and that's one of the things I really want the new regulations to deliver.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to bring it to a close there. There's all sorts of tension going on from the IT people who are looking at us. I'd just like to finish off by saying thank you very much to CLN for sponsoring the stage, Clive Miles, and also for Frank and CLN for supporting us through the podcast series. If I could ask you, if you haven't already got one, to grab a leaflet off of Louise or Madison, who are standing just in the middle aisle. There's a QR tag on there, and that will take you to our link tree where you can listen to our podcast on either Spotify, YouTube, Apple iTunes, whatever your preferred platform is. You can contact us on our website at openfirepodcast.com, or alternatively by messaging our page on LinkedIn if you want to slip into Maddie's DMs. Please follow us on LinkedIn. Please subscribe to us on YouTube or your platform of choice, and thanks for your support. Finally, can I say a special thank you to Aman and Peter, who have been brilliant guests, and if I could ask to finish off with a round of applause for our guests. So. That's a wrap. Done. Thanks very much, guys.